discuss this a little bit further now with Dr. Manali Kumar, who's a fellow with the Institute of Political Science at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Hello to you. Thanks for being with us. We've heard lots of very fine words from Boris Johnson and President Biden and also President Xi. What are you hoping for that will be meaningful, that will come out of this conference?
I mean, China and US are the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters, so it is a very positive sign that the two of them seem willing to at least cooperate on these issues going forward. And if we look at the wider international context, there is so much friction between the major powers at the moment. China is in a trade war with Australia. It's in a border dispute with India, and there is a sanctions pact with the EU. So in that context, the willingness of these international leaders to come together and talk about what is really an existential planetary crisis, this is an important moment for global governance. And, we really hope that these commitments and these ambitious pledges that they're making today will translate into meaningful policies going forward.
It is interesting, isn't it? You mentioned some of the difficulties that exist on the international stage between a lot of these countries. And yet it seems to be the case that with the likes of China and the United States, they are willing to cooperate on climate change. Does that mean you think that they get how significant this is?
One hopes that, but if we look at the track record, especially of the United States when it comes to climate action, it really does not have a lot of credibility. It never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Congress has barely managed to pass any climate legislation introduced by its own members. And Republicans and corporations have consistently undermined climate policies and undermined climate science. So in a sense, it's nice that in the White House, we now have an administration that at least does not dismiss science. It is taking the problem seriously. But the US, if we look at its emissions, it has the highest, among the highest per capita emissions in the world. And if we consider the US military as a country, then its emissions alone would rank higher than 140 other countries. So if the Biden administration really does want to be perceived as a leader on climate change at the moment, it's going to have to go much beyond the kind of promises that the US is very used to making and really start working towards building policies and implementing them to help move towards achieving some of these targets.
So cutting emissions by half by 2030 on 2005 levels, that's not good enough, you would say, for America?
It's an ambitious target, and I think it's a big step forward that the US has even made this announcement. They've been one of 4 major industrialized economies that has yet to make their nationally determined contributions public. So this is definitely a big step forward, but whether they can actually enact the policies that will be required to achieve these targets, that remains quite suspect because of American politics.
Talking about American politics, how much time do you think has been lost as a result of the climate denialism of someone like President Trump and the failure of America to lead in this field? And as a result, other leaders like Scott Morrison in Australia and Bolsonaro in Brazil feeling that they don't have to come to this party?
Yeah, I mean, US has made a lot of promises in the past, but when it comes to acting, they always stop short and they argue maybe other countries need to take the lead before the US is willing to take actual efforts to try and reduce its emissions. And so if we just look at the numbers, their emissions are so much higher than their per capita emissions are among the highest in the world. China's are only about a half, and India's emissions are a fraction compared to the US's per capita emissions. So for the US to expect emerging economies to do more when it comes to climate mitigation without taking efforts on its own, it's really not very fair given the developmental needs and infrastructure construction needs that still exist for these emerging economies. So the industrialized world really does need to do a lot more. They need to provide more financial assistance. They need to get serious about technology transfer if these different countries are going to try and reduce their emissions.
Sure. Okay, Manali Kumar, thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Headlines now here on BBC News. President Biden hosts a virtual climate summit with world leaders and pledges to cut America's carbon emissions by at least half.